Welcome. We are going to start with some quick housekeeping. This event is listen only, which means microphones are muted to reduce background noise. To adjust the audio through your computer, go to the bottom left of the screen, click the small arrow next to audio settings, and select a speaker. There are several Zoom features we will use. At the top of the screen, click the View Options button and select Exit Full Screen to display the chat panel on the right side of the slides. You are encouraged to use the chat for ideas or comments. As a reminder, select Everyone so all attendees can see your note. Please submit any questions to the Q&A box, not the chat. We also have audience questions submitted in advance. We will try to get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the event, which will take place between 4 and 4:15. If you experience any technical issues and need assistance, use the raise hand feature. The support team will reach out to you individually. For closed captioning, select the closed captioning icon for live captioning. We are recording this event, so let's start the recording and dive into our agenda. Thank you for joining for today's event, Volunteering and Civic Life During the Pandemic, The Path Forward. I'm Morgan Leedy, and I use she, her pronouns. We have a great event for you today and a packed lineup of speakers, so let's begin. I'd like to introduce our MC for today. Nirmala Singh is an AmeriCorps alumna living in Queens who served with NYC Civic Corps from 2017 to 2018 and later went on to oversee the Civic Corps program for 3 years through NYC service in the mayor's office. In May of 2022, the mayor of New York awarded Nirmala the AmeriCorps Alumni Impact Award for her efforts to support women, girls, and gender-expansive people during the pandemic who experienced gender-based violence, or GBV, as well as food and housing insecurity. Nirmala, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the introduction. As Morgan said, my name is Nirmala Singh. I currently live in New York, but I was born and raised in Guyana. And during my term of service with NYC Civic Corps, I supported the launch of the Women Empowered to Lead Immigration Navigators program, where we recruited and trained 30 immigrant women leaders across New York State with skills and resources to empower their communities. Upon completing my year of service, I saw the impact of service members in their communities that were underserved and really wanted to continue in the public sector. So I accepted an opportunity with the mayor's office of NYC to work with NYC Service, managing one of their largest national service programs with over 100 members serving at 50 different nonprofits across the city. However, in my own community, we started seeing an alarming number of gender-based violence cases just before the start of the pandemic. This work is personal for me because almost 20 years ago, I lost my aunt to intimate partner violence, and at 5 years old, I really felt helpless. And at 23, I felt exhausted seeing the same cycles repeat itself, especially in New York. So along with 5 other activists, Tanuja, Aminta, Candice, Mehar, and Fatima, we created South Queens Women's March. We started as a local gender justice organization working to curb GBV and supported survivors, but we soon had to pivot during the pandemic, like many nonprofits, to be a provider of many different resources for our community, from organizing pantries to distributing culturally responsive food products, essential health items such as period supplies and masks, but also items that brought joy to our community, like toys and books, for a really difficult time for thousands of our community members. Our work has grown significantly over the past 3 years. We now have over 75 active volunteer members. Shout out to AmeriCorps for teaching me how to recruit volunteers, and an office space where we offer free workshops, events for community members on topics like safety planning, financial planning, healthy relationships, and more. We also started teaching people about civic engagement and the role of their local elected officials. We want to empower residents to see that their voices and opinions matter. The early days of the pandemic were truly scary and overwhelming, but being able to serve my community alongside members of the community who cared made me feel more connected and grounded. My hope is that even more people will look around and realize that they have the power to make change. And that is what I love about AmeriCorps. Joining AmeriCorps really gives you the chance to develop skills, meet new people, and think about challenges in new ways. And that's why I'm excited to be our MC today to discuss trends on volunteering and civic life in America. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, the CEO, Michael G. Smith. CEO Smith is the 8th CEO of AmeriCorps, the federal agency for service and volunteering. He was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the United States Senate in 2021. CEO Smith has dedicated his career to social justice and public service in support of underserved children and families, and has previously served in the Obama administration and as the executive director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance. He is also a proud member of the Boys and Girls Club of America's Alumni Hall of Fame. Welcome, CEO Smith.
Thanks, Nirmala. That is what I am talking about. That is the power and the passion and the impact that you get from our AmeriCorps alums. You know, when I think about this incredible service that AmeriCorps members do, it's not just a year of service, it so often becomes a lifetime of service. And I am so happy that Nirmala is leading us in this conversation today as our MC. Welcome, everybody. It is an honor and it is a privilege to serve as CEO of AmeriCorps, the federal agency for service and volunteering. Allow me to bring greetings and gratitude on behalf of President Biden and our entire Biden-Harris administration family and our family, our AmeriCorps family that's getting things done for America from coast to coast. I'm grateful that you've joined our discussion today to talk about the impacts of the pandemic on volunteering and civic life in our country, and even more importantly, where we go from here. I also just want to thank our co-host for helping us to convene this important conversation and for their long-standing partnership on research and action to strengthen service and volunteering. So thank you to Points of Light, to Independent Sector, and to the National Conference on Citizenship. And thank you to our research partners at the U.S. Census Bureau for making this work possible. So today, we're sharing our new Volunteering in Civic Life in America research, which details our country's commitment to giving back and serving others, and it examines the pulse of our nation's civic health. So to ground our discussion today, I want to share a few key findings from the research, which my colleague, Dr. Mary Hyde, will dive into with more detail in just a few moments. So when we looked at this data, we had both cause for concern, but also cause for celebration. And there are also a lot of reasons for hope. So first, the cause for concern. Between 2019 and 2021, formal volunteering through organizations and institutions dropped by 7 percentage points. This is the first time that we've seen a dip of that size since we began collecting this data. In many ways, wasn't completely surprising, given the devastating illness and the loss of life that we experienced during the pandemic and the subsequent quarantining and safety protocols that aim to minimize the spread of the virus. But this is important because the social sector, which increasingly does not have enough resources, it depends on a steady stream of volunteers to support our children and our families that are in greatest need. So that's the cause for concern. But as I said, there's cause to celebrate. More than half of Americans, or 124.7 million people, informally helped their neighbors between September 2020 and 2021. And importantly, the informal volunteering rate held steady during the pandemic, nearly the same size as in 2019. So 1/3 of Americans informally help their neighbors at least once a month. And almost 1/4 of Americans, or 60.70 million people, formally volunteer through organizations in the same time frame, resulting in more than 4.1 billion hours in service. And I think what's important to note is that this data underscores a simple but important and profound truth. Despite COVID-19's devastating impact, Americans continue to serve each other and serve their communities. I also think this is a wake-up call for institutions in the social sector, including us at AmeriCorps. We have to be asking ourselves questions like, what more can we do to help people of all ages and all walks of life see themselves as volunteers and make sure that they have the resources they need so they can accept the call to service? We have to ask ourselves, how can we meet potential volunteers where they are and cultivate more opportunities to serve? We should ask, how do we modify our approach to a generation that is sometimes skeptical of traditional institutions? I told you earlier that I have a lot of hope. The data gives me hope, but so do the people. The AmeriCorps members who conducted wellness checks, supported COVID-19 contact tracing, and ran vaccination lines. I think about the nonprofits and the neighbors that set up learning pods for the children of first responders and those that had to work to keep our grocery stores open, our trains and buses running, and so much more during the pandemic. Or I think about the foster grandparents who learned to use tablets during school shutdowns to continue reading programs with young students. And I think about the countless volunteers like those I met just last week during the Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service, who start their journey with charity, but they end with justice. Every day, I meet AmeriCorps members and volunteers who start off serving in after-school programs, food banks, or health centers, and within just a few years, they've become educators and administrators, food policymakers and advocates, or public health professionals in their own right. So our speakers today are going to share their ideas on how to face these challenges and opportunities head on as we all work to invigorate service and civic engagement in our country. And we're going to start off that conversation with Dr. Vivek Murthy. Dr. Murthy serves as the 21st Surgeon General of the United States, the nation's doctor. And previously, he served as the 19th Surgeon General when we were colleagues in the Obama administration. He also serves as Vice Admiral of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, commanding a uniformed service of over 6,000 public health officers. Raised in Miami and a graduate of Harvard and Yale, Dr. Murthy lives in Washington, D.C., and is the proud father of two. Welcome, America's doctor, Dr. Murthy.
Hi, Michael. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here today and for joining this conversation about volunteering and service in our country and why it's so important to nurture our country's civic health. I want to start off by asking you a question about your own experience with volunteering and service. What is your earliest or fondest memory of service?
Well, that's a great question. And, it's particularly nice for me to be here and with an organization that is built entirely on the value of service. And I think that is just such an important part of what we need to engage in to actually help our country heal, especially after these last 3 years. So I'm really glad to be here with all of you and grateful for all of your work. I also just want to highlight something that I think you said in the very beginning, Michael, of your remarks, which is that so often that 1 year of service in AmeriCorps translates to a lifetime of service. And that I think is one of the great gifts of the AmeriCorps program. And so I just appreciate your leadership, Michael, and everyone here for bringing this program to life and serving communities across America. For me, my service journey really began early because I think about the first memory I had of when I actually, engaged in an active service. It's probably my parents used to have me and my sister make sandwiches every year that we would deliver to the local homeless shelter called Camilla's House in Miami. And that was a very important experience for us. And we would make the sandwiches together. It was a big operation in our house. And then we would take them and then we would actually serve them to folks, as part of their meals that the shelter would give to people, several times a day. And it was just, from a young age, taught me that a couple of things. One is that it's important to give, number one, when we're blessed to have something to give, and that we all have something, even if we're not well off. There is often something that we can give, whether it's our time, whether it's our money, whether it's our actions. But the other thing it taught me was that there is tremendous benefit that we get from serving, because I remember enjoying those days greatly. We'd get together with our family, other families. We would make these sandwiches. We would travel down there. We would do something meaningful together. We would meet people that we were serving and often have conversations with them. And I just, as a kid, I remember coming back just feeling like my world got bigger. Like on those days, I came to understand people in a different context, and I really enjoyed it. But the truth is, Michael, that for much of my life, I have been absorbing the ethic of service through my parents, who modeled it for me. And as a kid, I would actually, to be honest with you, I'd get annoyed because they were so engaged in service projects for their communities. They were helping build a temple in our community. They were volunteering for organizations. And a lot of times there wasn't boundaries around those service engagements. So calls would come during dinner time and my dad would step away to take a call, or my mom would have to leave to go do something. We just wanted them at home hanging out with us, right? So we would get annoyed as kids, but I now think about them, that example, so often, because when I had kids 6 years ago, a friend of mine gave me a bit of advice. He said, when you become a dad, your kids will sometimes listen to what you say, but they will more often listen to what you do. And I found that was true for me as well. And so I find myself thinking, how can I provide the same example for my children that my parents so beautifully provided for me and my sister, which is that a life of service is really the life that all of us can lead, and that we have to make it a priority. And it's not only good for a community, but it's really good for us too.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And thank you to your parents for instilling that ethic of service at such a young age, which also reminds me that it's never too young to start instilling that and setting that example by leading. Thank you for that story. Mm-hmm. I also want to ask you, you've written extensively about our country's loneliness crisis, which was exacerbated by the pandemic. And the impact of loneliness and what it can have on public health, that impact on public health. So as the nation's doctor, what would you say is the prescription to combat loneliness? And what role do you think service and volunteering can play in that?
Well, this is a really important and timely question, especially coming out of 3 years, where we've been grappling with this pandemic. And especially in the early days, that pandemic really separated many of us from each other, right? It wasn't as easy to see friends and family members. And for people who were feeling isolated or lonely before, it made it worse. But for many people who weren't feeling that way, the pandemic really brought those feelings to the surface. And so I do think it's important for us to talk about. And if we were live right now, I would ask people, and all of you who are joining virtually, for a show of hands to see how many of you know somebody in your life, whether it's you or somebody else, who may be struggling with loneliness. And my guess is that the vast majority of hands would go up, because that is true everywhere I go around the country. I find that many people are struggling, or they know people in their lives, their kids, their parents, their grandparents, or friends who are struggling with loneliness. So let's talk a little bit about what it is and then what we can do about it. It turns out that loneliness is a subjective feeling, that the connections that we need in our life, the social connections, are greater than the connections we actually have. And in that gap, we experience loneliness. People's experience of loneliness can often be quite different. Some people will react to loneliness by withdrawing and becoming quiet. Others will actually become irritable and angry. Some will seem aloof, because it turns out that loneliness can actually start to chip away at your sense of self-esteem and self, and make you and put you into this state of what's called hypervigilance, where you start to become more suspicious of other people. And sometimes we encounter those people and we say, oh, they're so aloof. They seem like they don't want to hang out with anybody. But sometimes actually the opposite is true. So the point is, loneliness can be the great masquerader. It can look different in different people. But what's important to know is that it's extraordinarily common. So however you slice the data, it's about a third of people are struggling with serious levels of loneliness in the country. But when you broaden that to say, moderate to severe levels of loneliness, who's struggling with that? It's more than half of people in America. And it turns out the group that's struggling the most are actually young people, which we don't often think about. We think, gosh, aren't they, especially folks who are Gen Z, millennials, aren't they incredibly connected by technology? Yes, but it turns out that spending more time on social media doesn't always mean that you're going to experience greater sense of connection, because it's really about the quality of the connections. It's not about the quantity of connections. And the question is, that I think about often when people ask me, what really constitutes a good relationship? How do we know if the relationships we have really count towards feeling less lonely? Well, the relationships that are most powerful are the ones where you feel that you can truly be yourself around someone else, where you feel that you don't have to put on airs, where you can be open, you can be vulnerable, you can talk about what excites you, but you can also talk about what worries you and what scares you. And you don't have to have dozens and dozens and hundreds of people like that in your life. I know sometimes we're in this sort of phase, I think, of society where it seems that the more friends we have, the better it is. And the more followers we have on social media, then that means we're more connected. It turns out that's a bit of a distraction. It's a quality that really matters. So what can we do if we're feeling lonely? Well, there are a couple of things, and service does figure prominently into this. I would think about this as what we can do as individuals and as what we can do as society, right? So as individuals, it turns out that there are decisions that we can make about how we prioritize people in our life. So we can, for example, make 15 minutes a day to reach out to people in our life, whether it's just to say, hey, I'm thinking of you, want to know how you're doing, or whether it's to ask them something specific, or just listen and see what's on their mind. We can also make the decision to give people the benefit of our full attention when we do reach out to them. Like, how often is it the case that you are talking to a friend and somehow your hand slips into your pocket and you're checking your inbox and looking at the scores and seeing what's on the news and checking social media, and before you know it, 30 minutes have gone by. You're not entirely sure what you've taught, a friend has been talking about, but you were there. And so our attention is actually very interesting, because when we focus on someone, which we can do just purely by putting distraction away, putting our phone back in our pocket, and choosing just to listen to them. When we do that, it has the effect of stretching time. It can make 5 minutes feel like 20 minutes or 30 minutes, because again, we are being fully present, and it feels that way to them as well. Service, I want to touch on as well, because this is one of the most powerful and underappreciated things we can do to help strengthen social connection. Because several things happen when we serve other people. One, we're forging a bond with them, whether that's for a minute, for an hour, for a day, for longer. And it's a bond that we're forging in a very positive interaction, right? And that helps us remember that we're not alone. There's something else powerful that happens, which is that when we serve other people, we actually remind ourselves that we have value to bring to the world. Now, why is that important? Because it turns out interesting with loneliness is when people struggle with loneliness for a long time, they can enter this downward spiral where the lonelier they are, the more they begin to doubt that they're the kind of person people want to hang out with. They start to think, maybe I'm lonely because I'm not likable or I'm not lovable. And I say that as somebody who was a child who struggled a lot with loneliness. I felt that way. I began to think over time, maybe it's me. Maybe it's not other people. Maybe something's wrong with me. And that made me even more hesitant to reach out to other people. So you can really, loneliness begets loneliness unless something breaks that cycle. And that cycle can be service, or that factor that breaks that cycle can be service. And so that is why I think service is so powerful. There's one last thing that's really powerful about service, of the many things out there, which is that when we serve with other people, it also forges a very powerful bond between us and others, right? So you think about members of our uniformed services, and I have the great privilege of leading one of our services, the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps. I think about the incredible work our officers do, our 6,000 officers, as well as our officers in our sister services in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and other services. And what's extraordinary about them is they're not just serving, but they're serving with others. And the bonds that they build with those they serve with are extraordinarily powerful, and they last, often for years. And I'm sure many of you listening today who are AmeriCorps volunteers have experienced that yourself. So these are some things we can do as individuals to actually help strengthen human connection in our life. There's more that we have to do as a society to build social infrastructure. We have to create opportunities for people to come together. We have to, in our schools, help infuse our kids with the skills and tools they need to build healthy relationships, which we can do in part through social and emotional learning curricula. In our workplaces, we have to create cultures that are grounded in human connection, where people have the opportunity to come to know one another, not just as, Michael, who's incredible at Excel, or Vivek, who's good at pricing strategy, but as human beings who have lives outside, of their skill sets. And we've also got to invest in programs in our communities that actually, whether they're faith-based programs, whether they're programs at places at the YMCA or other community orgs, but that bring people together across differences, people of different backgrounds, of different life experiences, to come to share space, to see each other face to face, to hear from one another, learn about one another, and to come together once again. This is all so important, the social infrastructure and the individual actions, because what we are trying to do and need to do now more than ever is rebuild the social fabric of America. That fabric has grown weaker over the last 5 or 6 decades. It feels like it's accelerated in recent years. We've seen rates of loneliness go up. And this matters because loneliness is more than a bad feeling. When we're lonely and we struggle with loneliness, it increases our risk of depression and anxiety, but also physical illnesses like diabetes, like heart disease, and like sudden death, dementia, the list goes on. But it affects us as a society too. Like when we are divided, when we're pulled apart, when we don't have strong connections to one another, it affects our productivity at work, it affects how our kids perform in school, but it also affects our ability to respond to emergencies. Think about the pandemic we've just been through. And one of the heartbreaking things about this pandemic is it does feel like at times that we've splintered, as a country in the face of this adversity. There will be more challenges that we encounter in the future, whether it's the ongoing threat of climate change, whether it's the threat of inequality and racism, which is ongoing, whether it's other new threats, biological threats to come. We need to have each other's back. We need to be connected to one another. We need to believe deep in our bones that we are responsible for one another, that we care and are invested in the well-being of other people. That only comes if we foster relationships in our lives and in our communities. So that to me is one of the greatest, not only public health challenges and priorities we have, but I think overall, one of the greatest priorities and needs we have as a country right now is to focus on rebuilding the social fabric of America.
Dr. Murthy, this is a master class. I want to go to the Dr. Murthy School on Social Cohesion, but this was just such extraordinary information. I myself am finding myself convicted about the quality of friends, not the quantity of friends. It's about the authentic time that you spend together. Such important messages, and I think for what everyone here, I hope what they heard too as well is that service is a part of the prescription. It is a part of the prescription for isolation and loneliness in this country, which is so important to the fabric of America. Thank you so much for that answer.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'm curious to ask you about, Michael, if you'll indulge me, is I think these last few years have been hard for everyone, but particularly hard for organizations, that have tried to bring people together and engage them at a time where individuals were just struggling under a lot of stress and worry, and whether it's economic concerns, health concerns about family. How did you and AmeriCorps manage over these last couple of years?
Dr. Murthy, thank you for that question. People ask me all the time what happened to AmeriCorps during the pandemic, and I am proud to report that AmeriCorps stayed in the communities where they are. We have 200,000 AmeriCorps members and AmeriCorps senior volunteers that are serving in more than 40,000 locations across the country. So when teachers had to figure out how to go virtual, AmeriCorps members had to figure it out. When nonprofits had to figure out were they going to create learning pods, for first responders or folks that were working in grocery stores and had to work, AmeriCorps members were right there. And our data shows that we served about 12 million people at the highest point of the pandemic. And I'll give you just 3 really great examples of what AmeriCorps members were doing during that time. One, I'm reminded of Grammy Fran, a foster grandparent that I met in Maine. Grammy Fran told me she got a message from the principal of her school where she used to do support with the young kids at that school. And they told her she could no longer come to school because of the pandemic. And to her, that was impossible. She couldn't imagine her life without being with her students. So she taught herself and some of her senior colleagues how to use an iPad, and she kept doing virtual tutoring with her kids. And then that summer, she created a virtual art program and then delivered in her car art supplies to students. I also think about the incredible number of people that helped with food insecurity. We had more than 34 million people, including 9 million children, that experienced food insecurity in the United States. And we had folks that were handing out food, doing Meals on Wheels there when our food bank saw such incredible demand. And I also think about some of the work that was happening with our Colorado COVID-19 Containment Response Corps. There, AmeriCorps members and AmeriCorps senior volunteers completed more than 17,000 case investigations, 1,700 contact tracing efforts, and approximate 32,800 test results. So those are just a couple examples of how AmeriCorps members pivoted. And when the going got tough, they got tougher and were there for their communities. So, Dr. Murthy, I think we are out of time. I just want to thank you so much for your ongoing service, for your leadership, for having the tough conversations, and for the way that you're making sure that our nation is going to be healthier and always that health matters.
Well, I so appreciate that, Michael, and I'm grateful for this time that we've had together. Maybe I'll leave you and the team that's here and all those who are listening just with one last thought here, which is, one of the reasons I'm so grateful for you is actually not just the service that you're providing. That's very important. And it's not only the legacy of service that you've continued to build after your year at the AmeriCorps, but there's something deeper that you have a role in helping do for our country and for the world, which is to help restore what I see as the moral foundation for our country. When I talk to people around the country, yes, they have lots of worries about, what may be happening in terms of polarization, in terms of the economy, in terms of other factors. But one of the deeper fears that I often hear from people is that they worry that we are somehow moving into a phase where we're becoming meaner to each other, where it seems like people are really out for themselves and no longer care about one another, where it seems like the rules don't apply to certain people, but only to those who don't have as much power, and where injustice is sometimes tolerated instead of dealt with. And they worry that the moral underpinnings of society, the core values that many of us seek to instill in our children and that were instilled in us by our parents, values like kindness, generosity, service, and love, that these are somehow fading into the background. And we can't let that happen. And the reason is because our values are the foundations upon which we build our relationships and our institutions and our society, right? Like we even think about leaders, right? When you choose somebody to run an organization, or to when somebody is, running, any operation, most of the decisions they're making, they're making behind closed doors because that's how it is. And what's guiding them in those moments? It's their values, right? When we are, in a community and we have to make tough decisions, on if we're all members of a parent community, we got to make some decisions for our school about where we spend out, scarce resources. What's guiding us in that moment? Ultimately, it's our values. And so we are only as strong as our values. That is and historically has been our greatest strength as a nation. It's a greater source of strength than the size of our economy, than the might of our military, than the breadth and of our academic institutions and our intellectual prowess. It is our values that give us our enduring strength. And this is a moment where we have to reaffirm those values, where we have to do so not only through our words, but also through our actions, by how we serve and by who we support, by speaking up for those who can't always speak for themselves. And through our actions, that we can demonstrate, model, and reinforce those core values of kindness, generosity, service, and love, then we will leave our communities and our country in a much better, much stronger, much more resilient place than many of us feel we have been in recent years.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. Everyone, please join me in the chat in thanking Dr. Murthy for his kindness, generosity, service, and love. We look forward to continuing to work with you. Nirmala, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you both so much for sharing your insights on the connection between our nation's help and participation in volunteering and national service. Dr. Murthy, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Hyde to come on camera. Dr. Hyde serves as the AmeriCorps Director of Research and Evaluation and plays a key role in analyzing, interpreting, and applying the research from volunteering and civic life in America. She is a community psychologist with more than 20 years of experience. Today, Dr. Hyde will provide an overview of the latest research on our country's volunteering and civic life trends. Over to you, Dr. Hyde.
Thank you, Nirmala, and thank you for those poignant and profound comments, Dr. Murthy, and speaking to our hearts. And so if you'll indulge me a little, I'm going to turn a little bit more and speak to our heads, but I know everyone is probably as touched as I am about the conversation that just happened. So with that, again, thank you for this opportunity to share some top-line findings from the 2021 Current Population Survey, Civic Engagement and Volunteering Supplement. The data I'm about to share with you speaks to those individual actions that we just heard about. And before I dive in, I want to first share a bit of background about the data itself, which is now publicly available along with complete documentation at data.americorps.gov. Following 9/11, there was a renewed interest in systematically studying civic engagement in America. That is the constellation of activities individuals engage in to make a difference in their communities. Volunteering through organizations is a prominent example of civic engagement, but it also includes activities like attending public meetings, participating in national service, and neighbors doing favors for each other, as we've heard our CEO discuss. The National Community Service Act of 1990 directed the Corps to conduct a civic health assessment. Since 2002, the agency has done this through an interagency agreement with the U.S. Census Bureau to conduct supplements attached to the current population survey. The CPS is a large federal survey that has been the primary source of labor force statistics since the 1940s. Each month, the U.S. Census Bureau administers a core set of questions to a nationally representative sample of American households. Their responses are the source of key indicators like the national unemployment rate. Each month, the census also attaches supplemental questions about a variety of topics, such as education, voting, or fertility to the core module. Supplement sponsors are typically federal agencies interested in understanding trends relevant to their work in the general population. In other words, for the past 2 decades, AmeriCorps and the census have conducted the most robust national survey on civic engagement and volunteering trends in the general population. We're proud to be part of a collaboration that produces this gold standard data. I'll begin with informal helping. Informal helping and formal volunteering are related and interdependent, but distinct types of civic engagement. Both are helping activities that involve giving time freely for the benefits of others. But whereas formal volunteering is coordinated by an organization or institution, informal helping is not. The best measure of informal helping in this supplement is exchanging favors with neighbors. As you can see here on the slide, over half of Americans, or 124.7 million people, informally helped their neighbors at least once between September 2020 and 2021. That is, a third of Americans exchanged favors with their neighbors once a month or more during this period. The national rate of informal helping also held steady between 2019 and 2021. Nationally, informal helping rates also held steady regardless of background in terms of age, gender, military service, and parental status. We saw a similar pattern for several other demographic characteristics such as race and ethnicity, and we'll be rolling out these findings in the coming months. One exception to this demographic trend was education. But despite the fact that 2021 informal helping rates remained high in every state, with at least 1 in 3 adults exchanging favors with their neighbors in the previous year, changes in rates of informal helping from 2019 to 2021 varied substantially by geography, as you can see here in this graph. The state level informal helping rate dropped by more than 3 percentage points in 14 states and increased by more than 3 percentage points in 8 states during this period. The bottom line here is that people kept helping each other informally during the pandemic, regardless of background, but we did see some variation by geography. This trend held up for other measures of informal helping and conversation in the CEV. National rates of talking or spending time with friends and family and talking or spending time with neighbors were also stable during this period. We see a very different pattern when it comes to formal volunteering or organization-based volunteering. As you can see here, almost a quarter of Americans, or 60.7 million people, volunteered through an organization or association at least once between September 2020 and 2021. Based on independent sector's estimates of the average value of a volunteer hour, we find that these volunteers served 4.1 billion hours with an economic value of $122.9 billion. The drop from 2019 to 2021 is the largest change in the national formal volunteering rate since we began collecting this data 2 decades ago. This decline in organization-based volunteering makes sense. Many people withdrew from public life during the pandemic. Think about parents of school-aged children who no longer served as soccer coaches. Think of older Americans who were unable to do their weekly tutoring at the local elementary school. This pattern is also consistent with findings about the impact of COVID on organization-based civic engagement by Points of Light, the National Conference on Citizenship, independent sector, and others. Nationally, we saw similar drops in the formal volunteering rate regardless of age or military service, as well as other demographic groups such as race and ethnicity. Yet, unlike with informal helping, the extent of declines in the national formal volunteering rate varied by gender and by parental status. The drop in formal volunteering was substantially larger for women than men. The drop was also substantially larger for parents of children under 18 than people without children in the household. We also found that the drop in formal volunteering was substantially larger for those with more education. We also see here that although the formal volunteering rate dropped in every state except for one, there was substantial variation in the extent of the change. The bottom line here is that in the general population, volunteering through organizations declined across the board during the pandemic. Some demographic subgroups and states were impacted more than others. This trend held up for other measures of organizational engagement in the CEV. National rates of charitable giving and belonging to an organization also declined during this period, although the change in the formal volunteering rate was relatively larger in magnitude. Of course, these trends have big implications for all volunteer-powered organizations, including but not limited to AmeriCorps. And one silver lining is that when we look at data sources that focus specifically on AmeriCorps members, we see stability in the impact of national service on volunteering. For example, what you're looking at here is data from our member exit survey. And this data indicates that AmeriCorps members who concluded their service before the pandemic reported about the same impact of service on their likelihood of volunteering as those who concluded their service between April 2020 and March 2022. This graph shows the share of exiting AmeriCorps State and National, NCCC, and VISTA members who said their service made them somewhat more likely or much more likely to volunteer for a cause or issue they care about than they had before participating in AmeriCorps. It suggests that at a time when volunteering through organizations declined substantially in the general population, national service continued to be a catalyst for enhancing volunteer capacity in America. In sum, the latest CEV data shows that although organization-based civic engagement declined across the board during the pandemic, Americans continue to help and engage with each other informally. When I take a step back and think about what these trends imply for the path forward, I think it's also crucial to consider it in the broader context of AmeriCorps' rich body of evidence, confirming that civic engagement takes many forms and that national service can strengthen civic infrastructure, including harnessing the power of volunteers to reignite civic life. Again, the bottom line here is Americans continue to help and engage with each other informally, regardless of background, but organization-based significant civic engagement declined across the board. These findings leave us with a number of unanswered questions, such as those you see here on this slide. The AmeriCorps Office of Research and Evaluation will be tackling these questions and others in the coming months. We'll be sharing findings from these analyses as well as related research through an ongoing webinar series focused on how we can reignite civic life together. So we hope that you please take the chance to register for these on our webpage in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hyde. I know that your overview just scratches the surface. So to learn more about volunteering and civic life in America research, you can visit americorps.gov/volunteering in America. And I believe our team will be dropping the link into the chat. The next portion of our event today is a panel with leaders in national service and civic engagement. Today's panel will be moderated by Evan Moon, a journalist from News Nation, a new and fast-growing cable news network. Evan previously worked with CBS News and Fox News. Today, Evan will be joined by Katie Fitzgerald, who is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Feeding America, the largest charity working to end hunger, Dr. Shauna Finley, Senior Advisor of District and Community Engagement at Communities in School, an organization that brings community resources into public schools so that students can have the support they need and are empowered to stay in school. And Lorraine Orr, Executive Vice President and Chief Operations Officer of the Boys and Girls Club of America, the nation's largest facility-based youth development programs. Evan, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As Nirmala said, I'm Evan Moon, a journalist based in Washington, D.C., and I am just thrilled to be moderating this panel today and speaking with true leaders in service and volunteering sectors. I'm really inspired by AmeriCorps' mission and the conversation with CEO Smith and Dr. Murthy, which really resonated with me personally, because just about a few weeks ago, I was listening to a motivational speaker talk about the pillars of happiness and how giving back can really create a sense of fulfillment in your life. So as a runner for my entire life, I thought, what better way to give back? I'll play to my strengths. And I connected with an organization called Teens Run DC that pairs local runners with teens from underserved neighborhoods so we can train for a 5K race together. When I was a teen running in local races was really how I first found my confidence, and I hoped to help other teens find this too. So the timing was just kismet to hear from AmeriCorps about this event, about the volunteering and civic life in America research, and just about the opportunity to connect with these leaders in different sectors so that we can all uncover new ways to invigorate service and volunteering in our country. So on that note, let's dive into the panel. I'd first like to ask a question to Katie Fitzgerald. Katie, Feeding America comprises a network of more than 200 food banks across the country to help bring meals and groceries to people who need them. Food banks also rely heavily on volunteers to operate. So how has your organization felt the impact of the dip in formal volunteering rates that Dr. Hyde shared earlier? And how were you able to adapt, especially in those early days during the pandemic when safety restrictions made it even more challenging to volunteer in person?
Yeah, thank you, Evan. And it's such an honor to be on the panel with Shauna and Lorraine and the incredible work that both your organizations do. So thank you for having us all. I'm an AmeriCorps from 1995. So, it's just been, it really has been a lifetime relationship with AmeriCorps and Vista, because in the organizations I've been in, I have engaged with the tremendous service commitment that so many millions of people have experienced through this organization. So, it was a perfect storm for the charitable food system in this country that many people can probably recall, where we saw almost immediate and sudden unanticipated spikes in demand because of the shifts that were occurring in the supply chain and the closure of restaurants and all kinds of places where people suddenly were without a paycheck and finding themselves, many for the first time, having to access the charitable food system. So the supply chain itself was seized up. So that was a challenge that is for a discussion for another day. But you're right, the impact on our operational model, which much like my peers' organizations is so based on volunteer support, was really quite significant. So prior to the pandemic, we would see maybe on average each year about 2 million volunteers in the Feeding America system, which is the largest charitable food system in the country. And we immediately obviously saw people not coming in, and most food banks wouldn't even let people in. So the question was, how do we not only shift our whole operating model to be addressing health considerations, but also making up for this volunteer labor that was gone almost overnight. Over 50% of the food banks did get National Guard support. So that's where these partnerships with public systems and government agencies and the private nonprofit sector and the private sector really are so important, because states issued and made sure that National Guard deployments were coming to food banks as well as other organizations. I know that made a huge difference. And then the model itself, many people will recall on television, long distribution lines, drive-through distributions, which actually were terrific in many regards, also not great in others, right? Because we didn't want people waiting for hours to be able to get access to food. But what they did do is allow us to use fewer volunteers and move people through food distribution much more effectively. We're seeing volunteering come back. And it's not at its pre-pandemic levels, but we're still about 30% below our pre-pandemic levels. And we don't really know, this data that you all just shared is hugely helpful. For our network, some of what we suspect is going on, that there's going to be a segment of volunteers who may never come back fully. Some people who are still really taking a lot of precautions, as they have every right to do. The other thing that we're actually think is going on is a lot of food banks also rely on corporate volunteerism. And because companies have shifted to hybrid work environments, and I see Shauna and Lorraine nodding their heads, we're not probably getting the same groups of volunteers coming in from the corporate sector as we did before, because they were all in office and they might take an off-site opportunity to come volunteer. So those are some of the things that we're seeing play out.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear that volunteering is at least on the rise post-pandemic. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Shauna Finley. Dr. Finley, we hear a lot about pandemic related learning loss in the news, but we also know that in many cases, students were able to stay in school, were able to stay on track and continue their education. This because of volunteers, including mentors and tutors. So how did school closures and other pandemic impacts affect the communities you work with, the ones who have wraparound support for students in school? And what role do you think volunteers can play in helping to bridge this learning gap?
I cannot thank you for this on a panel with Lorraine and Katie and with everyone that's talking about volunteerism and the importance of it in our country. To answer your questions, how did school closures and other pandemic impacts affect the communities where we work? Community partners lost access to schools, and as school leaders navigated issues of physical safety, health, and precautions. But we, communities and schools, we were one of the few who remained in schools because of our model of integrated student support. Thus, we were plunged into the front lines to deliver a lot of those tier 1 supports to families, which meant that we had to get in our cars to do home visits, deliver some supplies that families would need right away. I personally, in my community, you're talking about service, I serve on the school board in my community, and I happen to be one of the individuals passing out food in my own community where I reside because we saw the need and how important it was. So it was really hard for community partners, but they also became critical in being the hubs for those basic needs outside of the schoolhouse. So like us, the community had to pivot on how to deliver a lot of services virtually. Everyone was impacted by the increased demand for basic needs like food, medical supports, rental and utility assistance, and so much more. And crisis intervention was needed, but the challenge on how to deliver those supports affected everyone. Students, and we're seeing this right now, so this won't be anything that's going to be shocking to anyone probably on the call, but were and are continually impacted by the loss of social skills. So we saw a spike in the behavioral challenges appeared everywhere, causing great stress for families, teachers, and school administrators. And supports to address those social emotional skills became, and as I stated earlier, continues to be a paramount need for our communities that we're serving. And what role do we think that volunteers can play in helping to bridge those learning gaps? Well, volunteers were greatly hit as schools closed down. You didn't have access for the very same reasons above. And now that we are open, volunteers can play a very important role. Academic tutoring right now is a great need. The pandemic showed how some communities were able to create those learning pods, as we heard about earlier, for their children, so that learning gains were not impacted. But this was not the case. We know this across the board, where working families couldn't replace some school supports. Free tutoring can go a long way. It can be done before school, after school, and even virtual tutoring. Our Learning Buddy type of network is what we're thinking about as well when we're talking about some of these tutoring supports. And affiliates, which are our partners who deliver these supports throughout the country, do need to consider safety as to where they meet and how to protect those virtual platforms. So before and after school tutoring may still be the safest option. So I wanted to lift that up as well. And then intensive academic day camps may be doable if there are volunteers in the community to support such efforts. And I thank you so much.
Thank you. I know this was a huge issue facing so many families over the last couple of years, and it's nice to hear how we can continue to help. So thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Lorraine Orr. Lorraine, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America has an incredible footprint with 4,700 clubs across all 50 states, serving 4.6 million young people. In your role, you are connected to all parts of the organization, from club leadership, national partnerships, metrics for success, and critically child safety and protection strategies. So when you think about the first 2 years of the pandemic, what obstacles sort of took you by surprise? And can you talk a little bit about how you supported local clubs to continue to meet needs, kids' needs during this challenging time?
Yeah, thank you, Evan, and thank you for inviting me to be here. And to Katie and Dr. Finley, thank you for your comments, because so much resonated with me and my work as well. I would say, as I think about the biggest surprises for us as a system, one was, in February of 2020, we have 4,700 boys and girls clubs operating across the country. In March of 2020, that was down to 500. So, literally 4,200 clubs that closed in a matter of hours, just as, everybody's talking about here. And that was, one, something that we never expected to happen. And just like, I think for everybody, right? And we were scrambling. Now, the good news is that, we were able to start to reopen, and we're up to north of over 3,000 by the end of 2020. But with that said, it created a huge deficit in many communities, right? And in terms of where young people were to go, particularly since schools were closed, and many of our parents were essential workers, right? So they did not have the opportunity to stay at home. Like many of us did. So we were scrambling to try to figure out how we engage young people safely. So that was the biggest surprise. I think the second thing, not so much a surprise, but more so something that reinforced the spirit of our nation. Because I will tell you, people, corporations, other organizations came out of the woodworks to help us to make sure that our young people had the things that they needed, from obviously making their spaces available for our young people that in rural communities and others that did not have access to Wi-Fi and what that meant. So they opened their buildings. They provided resources to our clubs so that they can do that. They provided the technology, the equipment that we could pass through to clubs. And I would say for us as a national organization, nearly $48 million came in between 2020 and 2021 just for pandemic support. And that was mostly around people, right? And getting the necessary supports to local clubs. That's the actual cash. There was another 83 million that came in kind, and that was all of the PPE supplies that clubs needed, because with the opening and closing of schools, and with some clubs who have worked with multiple school districts, some were open, some were closed. So we had many clubs that were open from 7 a.m. to 10, 11 o'clock at night, because they also were providing those supports for again, essential workers. I think if I were to think call out a couple other things that were surprising for me, and I think probably Dr. Finley and Katie will say the same thing, was the quick pivot. I mean, we did not have time to think, and as an organization, to our footprint, sometimes we're like molasses, right? When we have to make change, but we pivoted on a dime. We started virtual clubs. Again. We're helping kids with their homework. They were doing their schoolwork inside of our buildings, and there were no questions asked. Our clubs came together, our leadership came together, and they said, we have a responsibility here. And Katie, I'd like to thank you, because many of our clubs partnered with your organization, and just through our clubs, 24 million meals and snacks that we got to kids and families. So we're grateful for you and your organization for helping there. I would say, if there was one thing for us that, and Dr. Finley mentioned this, as did Dr. Murthy, is the mental health and the emotional wellness of our young people. And that is the one thing that we are still looking for a system-wide solve for, is a partner that can help us provide those emotional supports for young people. Nationwide, we saw the increase of suicide and suicide ideation and abuse in homes, et cetera. And I will tell you, what you saw nationally, is happening for our clubs and our young people. Recently we just did a survey with our teens, and there were 3 things on their mind. It was emotional health, racial equity, and identity. And so those are, the words of what our young people are pushing us to do, which I believe we're obligated to do. But the quick pivot, the essential nature of our clubs and how I think we as a nation responded to the needs of young people were the things that helped us as a system move through this.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And I know we're short on time, but I'll just pose one more question to all of you, and we'll just try to keep our answers brief. But what adaptations or lessons learned from the pandemic might actually be worth keeping? Are there any innovations that actually did help grow service and volunteering in America?
So I guess since I'm still open, I'll quickly for us, we, like many organizations, lost 30-40% of our volunteers. But the study that was talked about earlier in terms of how communities or neighbors are helping each other, that just wasn't from household to household. That was also to the social sector, and I think that's something that is relevant for us. The second thing I think would be we were able to coalesce our states and areas, and they talked weekly to share best practices, and that's one thing that we will keep.
I'm happy to jump in, Shauna, if that's okay. The things that came to mind for me were sort of operational adaptations. So much like Lorraine and Shauna talked about. So we entered into new partnerships in meal delivery, including things like with DoorDash, so public-private partnerships where people could have their food that they normally would either come to a food pantry or a distribution, have that delivered to their home, and Meals on Wheels does great work with that too. So that was an adaptation. And then also some technology adaptations. So we stood up new technologies to source food more quickly into our network through our Meal Connect technology tool, and then also something we call Order Ahead, so that people who are utilizing a food pantry or can actually place a specific order for what they want through a tool and have that order custom packed for them. That was something that kind of really quickly mobilized during the pandemic and is continuing to grow leaps and bounds now.
That we outside of the network or outside of the schools who really wanted to partner, who didn't know how to do this type of work, but because of the pandemic and making that shift to be able to support kids, we have now increased the number of partnerships that we have, and not just from the lens of the volunteers. That's just one aspect of it, but even getting more parental involvement. Because now we have the opportunity to deliver some of these supports virtually. We want to make sure that we do it in a safe way, of course, but now we have parents that can now access some of those resources that our partners bring to the table. So those are some practices that we're going to keep moving forward. And thank you again for your time today, Evan, for facilitating.
Awesome. Thank you all. And I think that concludes our panel, but thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to our moderator and all of our panelists for your time today and all the work that you do to strengthen our communities. Now we're going to begin Q&A. Thanks to the incredible conversations today, we're a little short on time, but I know that the team has been answering questions in the chat as well. So thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions. Now you will have some space to ask questions to any of our panelists, Dr. Hyde, CEO Smith, or myself, but I'm going to pass it back over to Morgan to get us started on this section.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. I invite everybody to come back off camera. This is here. We're going to make the most of our time. So from the conversation we just had, it seems like there are challenges to recruiting and retaining volunteers at both ends of the spectrum of life. older volunteers and younger. Starting with older volunteers who bring such knowledge and wisdom and have different schedules so they can be available during the day sometimes. I would love to hear from Katie and Lorraine. How are you going about re-engaging older volunteers and addressing some of their concerns?
Lorraine, so I'll say for older volunteers, what I'm seeing food banks do is really have perfected some of the safety concerns that older volunteers have and may continue to have around when they come to volunteer in an aggregated, space. So still making sure that there are all kinds of safety precautions in place in terms of hand washing, which of course goes hand in hand with food safety, but in terms of the volunteer space, giving older volunteers options to volunteer from home. So some older volunteers are passionate about advocacy, much like sort of our younger generation are really engaged in that, but they are getting involved in that in increasing amounts. And then driving, even so some of our older volunteers who want to do meal delivery, much like Meals on Wheels sort of model, where we're seeing food banks kind of lean into that adaptation too.
And I would echo everything that Katie has said. I think the only thing for us that I would add is something that she said earlier, because a lot of our adult volunteers were coming through corporate volunteers, which has been obviously somewhat of a challenge. The other is through sports leagues. And as these are coming back online within our club system, I think we will see some increases there. We don't have our 2022 data as of yet, so it will that will be telling for us. I think the other thing from a virtual standpoint, we're still testing the efficacy of virtual clubs and what that means to kids and the impacts, right? So as we understand more there, I think then it will be time for us to do more intentional type of recruiting for older volunteers to support that body of work.
Oh, we're going to come back to this virtual volunteering in just a second. Although there seems to be interest in that. But Dr. Finley, you look like you're coming off mute. What do you got?
I was going to talk about virtual volunteering. That's exactly where I was going, but I'll wait, Morgan.
Okay, you were actually going to keep you're next to that. But before we go there, we talked a little, or we heard conversations about how young people are looking for sometimes different things in volunteering. And we saw in the Q&A box some questions around reducing barriers to service and increasing diversity in this experience. Michael, do you want to share what AmeriCorps is doing to reduce barriers to service, both for organizations, but also individuals?
Thanks, Morgan. First, I would say if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up somewhere else. So we had to start off by putting together our own diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, where we studied where have we done well, where haven't we done well, what are the numbers, what are the barriers that exist. We then hired our first ever Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer here at AmeriCorps, Nate Benjamin, who's doing an extraordinary job with his team. And we looked at both barriers for our members who are serving. We looked at things like the living allowance. AmeriCorps members serve sometimes 1,700 hours a year in places like Philadelphia, New York, and San Francisco. And our living allowance just simply wasn't enough. It hadn't kept up with the pace of living. We looked at the Education Award. When we first started AmeriCorps, that was incredibly competitive. But now you can go work at Starbucks and get dollars for your education. So we have to begin to rethink some of those things. But even on top of that, we also had to spend a lot more time thinking about the member experience, making sure that you get training, certifications, credentialing that happens during your AmeriCorps term, so you are clear after your AmeriCorps term in service, this can be a real leg up for you in career and post-secondary education. So it is an ongoing understanding of what we need to do to reduce those barriers, to make sure service isn't a luxury, but it is something that anybody can do no matter who they are, where they come from.
Thank you, Michael. Now, as promised, Dr. Finley, we'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're embracing virtual volunteering and what you've learned. In the Q&A box, we heard from some folks advocating for folks who have disabilities and how they need an alternative form of service. And virtual, for many, was that route. But I'm sure you've learned other things as well.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Morgan. Virtual options have been I would select anyone, but we've definitely seen an increase in these supports for students across the country. However, we have to be more careful when we're talking about the monitoring, the screening, and the safety issues that come along with the virtual options. So it's important that we continue to think about safety and have those volunteer background clearances, as well as training to support our volunteers who want to engage with our students virtually. Equity is important, so we have to always stand in a position and put ourselves in a position as volunteers and as organizations as a whole to make sure that we're meeting everyone's needs, meeting them where they are, because that is an equitable approach when we're talking about volunteering as a whole, but virtual volunteering as well.
Well, I would love to invite you because you've been such a wonderful MC, but you also have a wealth of knowledge as somebody who's run a program and an AmeriCorps alumni. Is there anything you would add based on the conversation you've heard today?
I feel like there's just been so much that's been said. And the one thing I definitely want to echo that I've heard throughout is that change can happen with any and everyone, and that everyone has the ability to create change. So even if you feel like you may not have a skill or something that you can share, we can all be great just because we can be part of a program, be part of a community, and we can all impact change, whether it's small, where you help one person, or you help an entire community. So just always take that with you wherever you go, I would say.
Oh, that's so wonderful and so inspirational. I feel like we should end on that high note. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to close us out.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Thank you, Nirmala. Thank you, Dr. Finley, Dr. Orr, Katie, Dr. Murthy earlier, Dr. Mary Hyde. We got all the doctors. We put lots of people with PhDs and MDs on this panel today, along with just so many great experts in this space. And thank you all for joining this important conversation. Without question, we are in a defining moment of our time, and I am confident now more than ever before about the power and potential of service to meet the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So where do we go from here? We will make sure that this research is available and accessible to all of you and to all of our peers that are in the volunteering and service sector and in the broader social sector. And then the next step is action. We're going to continue to explore the reasons and the motivations behind some of these trends, but we know enough to act on a few key themes. First is innovation. Necessity is the mother of all invention, and boy, did we learn a lot during these early years of the pandemic as we were forced to try new things. You know, I think one example would be our Public Health AmeriCorps program, which we have in partnership with the Centers for Disease Control. It's a $400 million partnership where we are taking more AmeriCorps members to work in public health and then giving them the training that they need so that they stay in public health careers afterwards. So, you know, looking back at this period, we've got to apply what worked. We have to scrap what isn't working anymore, and we have to continue to test out new ways of recruiting and retaining volunteers. The second thing is all about connection. People want to serve their communities. They want to see impact. And as Dr. Murthy said earlier, they are hungry for connections. And so volunteering for volunteering's sake isn't going to cut it anymore. We need to be clear about the benefits of service. And key amongst those benefits is a sense of connection, of friendship and community. And third and last is access. We have to make volunteer opportunities more accessible, and making them more accessible means addressing the real barriers to service and volunteering, like the cost of gas, groceries, housing, childcare commitments, and time restraints. And we have to be creative about the incentives and about outreach. It's not enough to flyer a neighborhood or put up one single tweet and hope that someone Googles us later. We have to meet people where they are and keep innovating and trying new things to reach audiences of all ages. And I'll end on an ask for each of you. Please encourage your family, friends, colleagues, and neighbors to get involved, volunteer, and take action too. Service brings us together and it keeps us stronger against forces that try to divide us. So whether you can volunteer long-term, short-term, or just one time, you have the potential to make a tremendous difference. You can go to AmeriCorps.gov and use the volunteer search tool provided by Volunteer Match, or you can use our AmeriCorps Fit Finder and we will put you on a right path. Again, that's AmeriCorps.gov. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all you do to get things done for America.